almost the very beginning. And it's always been well led. It's always been a successful organization. But between what Ken has done and what Diego has done, it's taken it to a whole new level. And not only does the trade prom keep getting better and better, but meetings like this, which are absolutely critical for exchanging information, setting the stage for the future, and for all the young people in the office trying to do the networking that allows you to get a better job, you need to stay involved with this organization, and you need to be as supportive as you can. I retired from Caterpillar in the first part of the year, and I have to tell you, it's a great thing. You get paid for not working. It's like being a Democrat. It's good as life gets. And, but it was also very liberating in the sense that I could sort of deviate a little bit from what, sometimes you have to stay right on the company line and what have you. Caterpillar is an enormously successful company, big free trader, but there's some nuanced issues that gave me some flexibility to at least engage. I traveled around the country for part of that time, and my goal was trying to get the business community to speak out on trade, and I failed. There's some notable exceptions. Caterpillar hosted CNBC, where they had export products in the background, and they talked about the importance of TPP. FedEx, I noticed, did a fair amount of activities, and GE as well. John Murphy and Linda Dempsey and others, really played a terrific job. But for the most part, the business community was sort of caught between two poles, in the sense that, on one hand, we all know that unless you're competitive, trade becomes a second issue. If you are competitive, all trade becomes an opportunity. If your organization is not competitive, all trade is a threat. So you focus on issues and improve your competitiveness. So that's lower taxes, that's better infrastructure, that's better education. Those things all fall into place. And from that regard, Trump embraced a lot of those activities. So you didn't want to go against publicly somebody that was supporting a more competitive environment. In the same token, American business is free trade. They get it. They have some concerns on pricing. There's a lot of import-sensitive issues, but they know just how successful a lot of these trade agreements have been. So it's hard to walk the line that says trade agreements are good, and therefore I should support one candidate. And I think really Kasich was the only person out there that was publicly supporting TPP in a big way. Ted Cruz talked about a value-added tax that would provide some relief as far as border adjustment of a tax system. But for the most part, people hid in the shadows. They didn't want to talk about trade. And if you look at the polling, I thought the polling was dead on what I was picking up around the country. If you look at the polling, the year began where there was a pretty good margin in support of trade. And the comment that Democrats tend to support free trade when Democrats are in control, and Republicans tend to support it when Republicans are in control, that's actually dead on. It's something I've seen over the years and the decades. But what also happens is, if you don't engage in the debate, people assume that charges against trade are true. And people went radio silent. Organizations, some of the biggest free trade advocates, whether it was agriculture or whether it was business, went radio silent. And as a result, I think you saw enormous erosion in support of free trade. Now, when you go out into the country and you talk to, and here, for the most part, the groups I was talking to would be middle managers, small businesses. It was, meeting in Buffalo, I was expecting 60 people, and we ended up with 240. But the one thing about Buffalo is it's enormously dependent on commerce with Canada, and everybody understood how important NAFTA is. So let me just break this down into three parts. One is the FTAs and NAFTA. Two is China, and then three is the future TPP. And just some basic facts about the FTAs. NAFTA. countries represent 1/3 of our exports. That's 1/3 of our exports. And to give you just a perspective, we export more to 145 million people in NAFTA than we export to China, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, India, Italy, Brazil, South Korea, Russia, Australia, Spain, and Indonesia combined. I mean, anyone who thinks that NAFTA hasn't been an enormous success, both from an export standpoint, and trade is almost in balance. There's a deficit right now, but it's pretty, when you throw in services, it's very modest. Let's just leave it at that. But to suggest that that level of commerce has not been a success is just, flies in the face of facts. On top of that, American companies have incorporated Canada and Mexico into the supply chain, which has made us more competitive all over the world. In addition to that, Canada and Mexico are allies, they're friends, they're hardworking, and the last part is the number one tourist location, foreign tourist location for Americans as far as foreign countries is Mexico. And as we enter the winter months, I want you to think about that. And even though when you go to Mexico, that's considered an import, it's probably an import you're going to need around February around here. So these are countries that as business we should be front and center defending, and when you make this presentation, when you look at the numbers from your own organization, it's the easiest thing I've ever seen to defend. Expand that to the 20 or the other 18 countries that are free trade, where we have free trade agreements. These are that's Israel, Chile, Peru, Australia, Singapore, and together the 20 countries with NAFTA, or the 18 countries with NAFTA, represents just about half of our exports. So I just want you to think about this from a macro standpoint. You take all of the countries where we have free trade agreements, and that's 400 million people. There's 7.4 billion people in this country. Half of our exports go to 400 million people. And what are we asked from our political leaders? We're saying, they're the problem. We got to focus on the place where we're exporting half of our exports to 400 million people. Not the other 7 billion, or when you take the US out of it, 6.7 billion people. I mean, anyone in business knows where the opportunity is. When you go around the country and you talk about the FTAs, you talk about Chile bringing in fresh grapes in the winter, but more importantly, wine year-round, people like it. They like Chile. They like Israel. They like Australia. They like the free trade agreement countries. Jerry Weller played a leadership role on CAFTA. We have a trade surplus with every country in CAFTA except Nicaragua, and that's a $1 million deficit. These are successful agreements, and they're worthy of our defense, and we should defend them aggressively. China. China is one area where business is careful. The importance is overwhelming, both in the here and now, but particularly in the future. But the one thing to keep in with China, and I think there's the China accession to the WTO gets sort of a raw deal. Some of us were involved with that. China joined the WTO in the late 1990s on terms that were set in the late 1990s. No country has changed more in the last 2 decades than China. Massive investments in infrastructure, massive investments in education. Go to any American university, you see it firsthand, and massive investments in technology. China is fundamentally different than it was 20 years ago. But the terms of trade with China are the same that they were 20 years ago. Now, in the past, that was not a big deal. For those of you that go way back and remember the various GATT rounds, there are lots of GATT rounds. There's the Dillon round, and the Tokyo round, and the Kennedy round, and you go on and on. We're going way back. But my point was, we used to revise trade agreements every decade or so. We don't revise trade agreements anymore. It's too hard. We don't do it through the WTO. We don't do it through bilateral agreements. Yet countries change. Some countries change dramatically. The terms that China's operating with today does not necessarily make sense. It doesn't make China bad. It just means that we need to renegotiate a relationship with China. It would be best to do that through the WTO. It would be okay to do that regionally, maybe as far as working with TPP. It would be okay to do a bilateral. Hank Greenberg with AIG has been calling for this forever. Or you could do it through a trade war, which would be enormously destructive. So, the goal isn't to demonize China, but it's to be serious about resetting the terms of trade with China. And hopefully we could do it in a way where we're moving toward greater trade liberalization, not greater restrictions. TPP. Nobody knows what TPP is. I mean, there's nobody walking around that has TPP tattooed on their arm or anything like that. TPP wasn't an issue in the election. NAFTA, people know what NAFTA is, people know what China is. But one other thing about China, just to point out, we have a massive trade deficit, about $700+ billion. Half of it is with China. Now, economists can rationalize that. China saves too much, we spend too much, and there's currency manipulation, maybe not. There's all sorts of reasons for this. I don't know who's right. I'm not an economist, but I do know from a bilateral standpoint, while such a trade deficit may be sustainable economically, I don't think it's sustainable politically. So it needs to be addressed. TPP, I was never one of the ones, and I was very careful never to speak publicly about it, but I was never a believer that this was going to get done in a lame duck. Anyone who has experience with lame ducks know that other than the GATT Uruguay round, there's never been a big agreement done through a lame duck session. Just looking out, it's probably a 2019 issue if things go right, because you're going to have to reset the politics on trade, both from a Democrat and a Republican standpoint. But the one thing that could break it loose is if Japan worked with the other TPP countries and tried to move forward. It would take some renegotiation, and tried to move forward without the United States. The notion that the United States is going to cede markets, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, heck, even Brunei, that we're going to cede these markets to our trading partners, I think would ultimately motivate both the President Trump and the Congress to move with greater vigor to get this done in the next Congress. Summarize, hey, listen, the future, we can mold the future, but we can't mold the future if we continue to go radio silent and hang out in the shadows. This organization can play a big role as far as convening meetings that can educate people and give people the courage to speak out publicly. But unless our organizations speak out publicly, we're going to be on defense for a long period of time. So thank you very much.
Okay, as you can see, we've convened a highly compelling and very convincing panel, all of whom have their comments based in fact and not campaign rhetoric on the issue of trade. Now we'd like to turn to the audience and see what questions they have, so I'll just call, if you could please stand